And whatever your artistic act is that calls to you, it's almost like you're showing up to the relationship with your myth maker every day. When you start dying in your moment of death, no one is going to be there with you. And again, the truth of what you are is this contentless awareness. The only thing that will be with you is going to be your myth maker. And that art is the lifelong process of having the most intimate type of love with the myth making part of you. You know, because what's the ultimate byproduct of the highest form of love? It's creation. And that art is the byproduct of the relationship between the truth of who you are, which is this contentless awareness, and the most intimate part of your psyche, which is the myth maker.
Welcome back to the transmission, my friends. Finding spiritual purpose, a personal philosophy, a personal mythos that is both intellectually honest and potent, that is a real task. Clearly, it's one of my favorite linguistic pastimes and greatest preoccupations if you have listened to my show for a while. But the two often do not harmonize, that intellectual honesty and that potency. I mean, I can summon all sorts of stories that in the short term will make me feel better about my life and the human condition, but are they intellectually honest? Do they really represent reality faithfully in all of its glory and horror and multifacetedness and open-endedness? Usually no. And that is why, in part, I love melding minds with my wonder brother on this episode, Erick Godsey, because it feels like we're both after the same thing in that respect. If you don't know Erick Godsey, he has a wide breadth of knowledge in topics like psychology, philosophy, spirituality, and the esoteric. We drink from a lot of the same wonder waters, I think it's fair to say. We're both heavily influenced by people like Carl Jung, Joseph Campbell, and their mythopoetic romantic brethren and sistren. Erick is also a very passionate, well-spoken orator, and I think that's why I get so many comments about our mind melds. I think that's why he's always one of the most requested guests to have back on. We tend to really let the esoteric goods dangle out in our conversations, and this one is definitely no different. We get into the central importance of creativity when it comes to purpose making and sense making, along with plenty of Jungian musings, including an idea that wraps around this conversation is the notion that the Zeitgeist, the spirit of the times, seems to be ruled by a kind of immature god, a kind of dark god obsessed with materialism. We also muse a good deal about the ever-present enigmatic figure of Hermes Mercury, why he's so central to psychology and the esoteric, and so much more. Unfortunate production note, I did not select the right microphone on my side of the conversation, so this will be somewhat lacking the fidelity you are used to. I did everything I could to salvage it. I did minor sacrificial rituals. I shed blood, so I don't want to hear
any complaints.
It's not that bad. It wasn't that bad. Anyway, all of the portals you require to reach Erick Godsey, his podcast, his doings, his website, you will find those links in the description. You will also find the necessary keyboard mudras for third eye drops, including all of our podcasts. By the way, we've got over 300 audio-only podcasts that will never be posted to video here, so do subscribe to Third Eye Drops on Apple Pods, Spotify, wherever you listen. Of course, do tickle the algorithm here on YouTube. It is of the utmost importance to get those likes and those subs. And one of the best ways to not only support these mind melds, but initiate yourself further into the wonder and mystery is to join us at patreon.com/Third Eye Drops. We do monthly live Zoom hangs, book club gatherings. We have a patron-only Discord server. You can get physical rewards like stickers, pins, shirts, and more. And with that, my fellow sentient sacks of stardust, let's meld minds with my wonder brother, Erick Godsey.
So you are currently in a phase of reassembling the entity known as Erick. And
Yeah.
I'm both excited for you because that's always an instructive, novel thing to go through. But I've known you for long enough, dude, and I've seen you go through a lot of visionary experiences and retreats. And it seems like this is different. It seems like you're going through a bit more of a, like perhaps things got even more entropic than usual or something.
Yeah. So for people who don't know, I recently did 7 sits with ayahuasca. And the reason that happened was not because I felt like I needed it. It wasn't like I was trying to heal or transform something, but I had 2 different opportunities to go to 2 different retreats where people at each of those retreats were some of my closest friends. And I had helped one through a time in his life where he was thinking about killing himself.
Oh my God.
And the other one was because my fiance was holding her first ayahuasca retreat as like not a person who serves, but the person who holds space. And so I said yes to both of these. And the way that it played out is they were 1 day apart. One was in Costa Rica, and then I came back for a day, and then I went to Peru into the Andes. And it was too much to put into a trip report, which is what I've done for the last 12 years. If I had actually tried to do that, it would be a book, and there's other things that I want to do, then spend the next 6 months trying to articulate states of consciousness that people who haven't experienced it thinks that it's made up. And for the people who have experienced it, it's not like really new content. It's just different versions of the same anime cartoon, like you know how it plays out. But I guess what I could do is I could give a very brief overview of what each of these nights were, and then like what I came home with and what I'm working on now.
Yeah, if you want to talk about it and you feel like you've assembled your thoughts enough, sure. Otherwise, we can, you can let that slow cook however long it needs to.
Well, then I'll give the abbreviated version of the abbreviated version that I was about to give. And the essence of it is that...
Cool. So it should only be about an hour and a half.
The essence of it is that this was my 24th or something time by the time I got to the end. And one of those was the first time that I had ever purged in the space. And long story short, it was incredible. I had needed it. And physiologically, it felt like something that was from my childhood that felt like a piece of stone or bone that was connected to my like pelvis. It felt like it dislocated, and like I then went to the bathroom and I shit and it felt like it came out. And I have no idea what it means. It didn't come with any content, but it feels like I'm feeling the reverberations of that moment. So that was big. The other thing that was very big was that an overarching theme that was coming through is I recently read an essay, and you would love this essay. It's called The Psychology of It. And I can send you this PDF, but it's a neo-Jungian essay on the collective unconscious that is very provocative. He disagrees with Jung about the quality of the collective unconscious. And just by the way, I do not enjoy his writing style. I'll let you read it and we can talk about if you read, but the idea he talks about is super interesting. And it's that the collective unconscious is not this like omnipotent, almost transcendent, no kinks in it type of mystical, profound thing. It's like a divine child God. And that this divine child God, because it has never had to compete against other gods, like the human collective unconscious amongst all the collective unconscious of the organisms on this planet, has never had to compete because none of the other ones can enter into the domain of language and ideas. Because it hasn't had to compete with anything else on this planet, it hasn't grown properly. And this is why, from his perspective, there's like our obsessions with war, why capitalism and consumerism and like Hollywood is able to capture so much attention, and that the what people who are able to grok this, the call is to actually like connect yourself to the collective unconscious child God and help raise it. And the way you help raise it is first you have to do something to get its attention. So like the video that you did on synchronicity got a little bit of that God's attention. Like you can actually measure what has its attention by what's currently popular. Whatever has its attention, the character of the thing that attracts its attention creates a feedback loop on it to teach it how it ought to be. So if you think of, so the idea here is that the thing currently catching this entity's attention the most is our news, Mr. Beast on YouTube, blah, blah, blah.
Right.
And that the call of the artist is not to become famous for fame's sake or whatever, but that fame is a proxy of doing something unique enough to catch the attention of this thing. So the idea that I've been playing with is he called it. That felt not mythopoetically fun. And so the word that came through for me was Zod. It's the Zeitgeist God. And that like the ecosystem that animals evolve in, what that would correlate to this is the pleroma is what Jung called what we would call the zeitgeist. That's like an that's an atmosphere. It's like a place where things can grow. Dominant ideas are like organisms. So like a killer whale would be something like Zeus to the ocean. Like it's like a top animal. It's like an apex predator.
Yeah.
Zod is currently like the apex predator of Western culture. And the idea is that he's sick. He's this sick thing that's obsessed with like war and porn, and like what's happening on the news. And that each of us, regardless of if we're aware of it, the content of the conversations that we have every day, the content of the things that we post online, everything that we reshare, all the comments that we have, all that shit, even the things that we click on with our thumb on the Instagram discover feed because it's tracking that, all that is putting input into this thing.
Yeah.
And that, like, what would be, the thing that I've been playing around with is like, what would be a strong story for people who are interested in trying to heal the culture? Like, what would be a practical and inspiring story to help people, quote unquote, raise Zod? And that's an idea that I've been playing with. So I'd love to hear what you think.
Yeah. Well, there's a couple pieces of clarification and nuance I think we should run through quick, just so people are like fully on the same page. So for Jung, he had this sort of majorly speaking, this sort of three-tiered model of the psyche, which consisted of your personal consciousness, your personal unconscious, and then the personal unconscious is attached to this realm that Erick's talking about, the collective unconscious. And then within that collective unconscious is where you find archetypes, which are these like primordial qualities that emanate from that collective unconscious into the personal unconscious and speak to your conscious mind through dreams, images, etc. The thing that I'm not sure if I understand in what you're talking about is, so Jung also talked about this divine child archetype. Like he talked about it a lot in the Red Book, and I think I wish I could remember some of the quotes, but I know there's one about serving a child and God is a child at play and things to this extent. And there's some other ones I can't remember, but so in that sort of like general outline of the canon, if you want to call it Jungian story, where is this guy's big departure from that?
Yeah. So I think just for the sake of us having a conversation that we would have fun with, let's just say that Zod is a complex within the collective unconscious that is particularly the byproduct of the collective wounding of mankind through
Okay.
war and through civilization and urbanization and industrialism and agriculture. So let's just say for you and I speaking, because I don't agree with a lot of what he said, but I think the core idea is interesting. The collective unconscious is the realm in which the archetypes live. You're familiar with what Jung's idea of a complex was, right?
Yeah, yeah, but like a complex is typically in the personal unconscious. So it's like this, it's hard to get to the bottom of like what a complex is, but it's
You
it's
can
an
think of a complex as a constellation of protector parts around a wound in an individual. And so if you take this to the collective unconscious, this entity is like what a complex would be to an individual. It's one of the major trauma complexes to the collective unconscious. And are you familiar with the idea of like Watiko?
dude. I can't fucking believe you're bringing this up because this is something that I just for the first time heard mentioned, and it's come up several times. So the most recent video I just put out was on what I was calling soul sickness.
Yep.
And I heard about that like deep into my editing process. So I'd already recorded it. And had I heard about it, I probably would have used that vernacular.
Yep.
Then I heard about it through someone else, actually, that we were just talking about before we were recording. And then someone also brought it up in my comments. And I'm like, yeah, fucking, like, why is this coming to be like a day too late? But yeah, so I just heard about it recently.
Yeah. So I'm getting goosebumps. Okay. So what the Gnostics called the demiurge and what the common zeitgeist is now calling Watiko, and what like Jung would call the byproduct of the hyper intellectuals believing that they know how all the things work and that produces dictators and isms. All of these are like the blind men trying to feel out what the elephant is. Like
Yes.
they're all parts of the
Yeah.
same thing.
I'm also laughing because I used that very recently too. But
Yeah.
go, keep going.
And that like kind of one of the core ideas that I'm trying to put forth through this idea is that in the realm of space-time, which is like where you and me are speaking and we have bodies and we have to find out how to go to the bathroom, and so like we need order, like the fighting metaphors work in space-time when they have to be used. So like if someone's trying to break into my house, I'm not going to use, like gratitude and love to alchemize their anger. I'm going to fucking put them on the floor if I have to. In the realm of the psyche, which is not the same realm as space-time, and we could go deep into that and it's nuanced, but just for the sake of this convo, that is where Zod / Watiko / the demiurge lives. And that its essence on some level is violent, reactionary anger. And that most people that I know who are spiritually awake and want to help, they get caught in kind of conspiratorial knots. And to be caught in a conspiratorial knot is to feed Watiko. It's to feed Zod. And that the ultimate alchemy in the realm of psyche is actually alchemy. It is not violence. It is not fighting. It is not going to war with. There's a quote, if you use the master's tools to overthrow the master, you become the master. And it's like a warning. Like if we use the metaphors of war and fighting and destruction, we're actually feeding the thing that we're trying to heal. Because fundamentally, in the 200-year arc of the human game of life, if we do not alchemize Watiko, God, not God, but Zod, we have the opportunity to end the human game, And so like the thing that I'm trying to drive home for people is that the weapon that works best in the realm that Zod lives is alchemy. It's to actually see the thing,
Yeah.
incorporate the thing, be transformed by the thing, find the empathy and the compassion and the forgiveness and the grief. And this is a whole thing that we could get into, but I think the have you seen Princess Mononoke?
How many times?
Perfect.
I used
I
to have,
think
I used to have Mononoke posters in this actual
yeah.
room. Yeah.
I
Yeah.
think it's one of the best stories that I've ever seen in my life. It's one of
Same.
my favorite. The essence that creates the demon at the beginning is like a lead bullet, which is a symbol of hatred and unprocessed grief, creates the monster. The essence at the heart of Zod is the unprocessed grief that humanity has gone through because of all the war that we've had, which is, like it's it's a long arc, but just to incorporate it quickly, once we started getting good at agriculture, we started having to fight and compete for resources in a way that we hadn't to in the past. It eventually led to us doing things like war, and that has scaled all the way up to the atomic bomb. And so much unprocessed grief has been accumulated that I think like the alchemy of our time is almost to become like grief midwives for Zod. It's like we have to actually like go up to Zod and suck out the like poison as the alchemists that we can train ourselves to be. And to do anything other than that would be to feed it.
Yeah. So we're mixing a lot of ideas and metaphors, and I'm always down for that. But I also want like linguistic precision in that we're talking about this novel way of discussing something that I think is pretty pre-established, which is this idea that there is this almost kind of like shadow archetypal being that is the dark reflection of the human desire to innovate. And you could almost call it like a shadow alchemical process where instead of being obsessed with taking a primary material and creating something sacred out of it through various transmutations, this journey from inert stone to the lapis, the stone that's filled with life, with miracles, with immortality, etc. It's almost like we have begun to worship the opposite. Like, how can we take the essence of our lives and commodify it into consumable, vapid darkness, right? It's like, it's kind of what it seems like we've collectively become obsessed with doing. And I think I'm sure I've said this quote before, and I've probably said it to you, but I think this helps when it will help to introduce this eventually, because alchemy is one of those phrases that it's becoming overused in the zeitgeist by spiritual types and by like new age types. Like a lot of people like to use the word alchemy because it sounds like a magic trick or something. But the central figure, and you'll find it in any alchemical imagery in this process, is Hermes. And Hermes is always at the center of this. Like the symbol for Mercury is always at the center of this practice. And Jung has this brain melting quote from Psychology and Alchemy about just how central and endemic to the process of individuation, personal transformation, finding something sacred in life that this Mercury Hermes character is. And this is such a deep topic that it's hard to bring up outside the confines of somebody who's already mythopoetically interested, because they're like, what, the god who runs really fast? Like, what are we talking about? Right. But I'm going to resist the urge to like talk about specific myths and just say the fundamental archetype, if you just remove the name Hermes, Mercury, or any of his other syncretic equals, is a being that transcends boundaries and carries some kind of information. And if you look at what alchemy is, it's the transformation of information through various states. It's literally the same thing. And that brings me to this brain melting quote by Jung, which I know I have in a notepad somewhere because it's going to be in this video that I'm working on. It's a long quote, but it's sincerely brain melting. And yeah, the multiple aspects of Mercurius. So he sometimes says Hermes Mercury, sometimes says Mercurius. It's the same archetype. The multiple aspects of Mercurius may be summarized as follows. 1. Mercurius consists of all conceivable opposites. He is thus quite obviously a duality, but is named a unity in spite of the fact that his innumerable inner contradictions can dramatically fly apart into equal number of disparate and apparently independent figures. 2. He is both material and spiritual. 3. He is the process by which the lower and material is transformed into the higher and spiritual, and vice versa. 4. He is the devil, a redeeming psychopomp, an evasive trickster, and God's reflection in physical nature. 5. He is also the reflection of a mystical experience, the artifacts that coincides with the opus alchemium. 6. As such, he represents on one hand the self, on the other the individuation process, and because of the limitless number of his names, also the collective unconscious. Swallow that. Fucking swallow that, man. So, yeah, like you essentially have one archetypal symbol that can somehow encompass the entire psycho-magical transformational process that a person can go through. And all of that, like, colorful language aside, I think it's actually a lot more simple mythologically. If you go back and you look at myth, who's the figure that is closest to man and is constantly like interacting with man and bringing them transcendent knowledge? It's Hermes. It's Hermes that's talking to Odysseus. It's like, you go back in the myths, it's always Hermes who's like delivering a message and somehow intervening in the process. And I mean, even myths say like Hermes is the most friendly god to man and things like that. But that's not to say that he can't be malevolent too, because like it says, Hermes is the devil. Well, what does that mean? Anybody who's gone through like a really dark psychedelic experience, I think knows exactly what that means, because when the trickster shows up in a really dark kind of way, it's absolutely terrifying. But anyway, I'm rambling on for way too long, but I think it's important to understand the width and breadth and application of some of these archetypal images that already exist, which is why I wanted to take a little sidestep and talk about Hermes, because we're talking about these other words that I think are fitting some aspects of something that might already be established in a little bit of a more already entrenched way,
Yeah, the thing that I want to zoom in on is Hermes as a representation of the devil, because that actually touches on what I was trying to articulate about like the new orientation to this complex and the collective unconscious that I'm playing around with calling Zod. So, most people who I know who are spiritually activated and trying to find their way in the world, but almost none of them have found their artistic practice that they work on every day. So they have this kind of like distrust and contempt for the justness of reality because they actually don't think it's just. They really like the Gnostic story of the demiurge because it implies most people's understanding of the Gnostic idea there is that something went wrong in the universe and that we are actually trapped inside of something that is not just, that is actually malevolent. And, that is the devil archetype. And then you can move into how that shows up in most spiritual people right now is that there's some story about either dark forces or entities or aliens or something outside of the realm of the just universe,
Yeah.
that is taking away your freedom. It somehow makes this thing unfair, et cetera, et cetera. The idea that the archetypical part of existence that the Christians gave the label the devil is evidence for an unjust universe is the type of thinking that feeds Zod, that feeds Watiko.
Yeah.
Because you can think of Watiko analogous to what a cancer cell is to the body. The cancer cell biologically is unable to receive the signals from the body that would let it know that it is a part of a tremendous group of things that are like it, that work together to produce the thing that it depends on. It can't get that information, and so it thinks it's alone. Because it thinks it's alone, it maximizes its own growth.
Yeah.
And if you think about the cancer cell analogy, that is kind of the essence of the style of gameplay that this complex in the collective unconscious is playing out. I'm not safe. I'm afraid. Do whatever I can to protect my individual self at the expense of the thing that I don't realize I depend on. And that what allows for that to be true is a fundamental confusion about, quote unquote, what the devil is. And the thing that I want to offer is that I think the fundamental thing that is happening on this planet is that Gaia is a living organism. I don't think that's metaphor. I think that's literal.
Mm-hmm.
And that this is where it's going to start to get into my own, this is just a made up story, but this is what I am playing with right now, is that when the meteor hit this planet 65 million years ago and killed almost all of the children of Gaia, she was like, I've got to figure something out. And so she started to bestow her wisdom, which is what was called Sophia, into the mammals that could hold it and do something in the future with that wisdom if a meteor were to come again, because it would. And so she picked the thing with thumbs. It's not that we were special. It's that we had the architecture to do something with Sophia that could protect her and her children at some point in the future. But she knew that it was a risk, because the way wisdom grows is that there must be choice and there must be the wrong choice. And the wrong choice has to fucking hurt. Because in the absence of choice and high stakes, wisdom cannot grow. And so a fundamental aspect to the alchemy of growing wisdom is evil. And that it is actually not because the universe is not just. It's not because there's some unfair thing that has happened and we are the playthings of larger things that have to feed off of our bad emotions, and that actually there are lizard people running the whole thing to extract the maximum amount of fear out of people. It's that the only way wisdom grows is with choice and with high stakes, and that the devil, quote unquote, is a fundamental part for us to play the game that we're meant to play.
Yeah.
And that if you bring that architecture to any terrifying experience that you might have in a non-ordinary state of consciousness, I think what really fucks people up is when they have a cosmology where something that is arising in their consciousness, they label as not of their consciousness.
Yeah.
And this is where it's an evil entity or the devil or whatever. What I have found in my life, and I've done a lot of extraordinary states of consciousness adventures.
Yeah.
Nothing has ever arisen that I couldn't alchemize by assuming this is a neglected part of me arising symbolically that has a lesson for me. It has worked literally 100% of the time. And that every time any human on this planet has a non-ordinary state of consciousness experience where they interpret some part of them as the evil other, and they spiral out, and it creates this massive influx of fear. Not only in that moment do I think it feeds Watiko, But then the way that they go about living their life continues to feed it. And to kind of jump track real quick, and then I'll pass it back and we can see if we can make some sense of this, is that like one of the big wounds of our culture right now is that the average person does not trust the stranger because of the way the news works, because of the way social media works, because of our echo chambers. We assume the archetypical stranger is either trying to exploit us, trying to hurt us. Most people, if they're not deeply wounded, believe that the stranger is trying to exploit them. You know, like this is something that I see in like being a part of Fit for Service, is that if there is a group of people coming together and it looks like they're having a great time, the assumption is a cult. Like the assumption is that there's something happening there that is inherently exploitive. And then anyone who doesn't have a lot of money, when they see anyone who does have money, they assume anything that they're doing is somehow inherently exploitive. One of the things that I talk about that has really resonated with people that I think is interesting is that most people are in a worldview where the idea of going to college doesn't seem like it's deeply exploitive. But that if they see someone who has taught courses about how to make money for 6 years and they see ads every year for the last 6 years, they assume that person is a liar or a cheat. But if you think about it for a moment, people who advertise their business through anything online that is not hidden, it's actually their identity. We live in a culture where if you are full of shit, you're not making it to year 5. Like you would be blasted and outed to the point where it wouldn't be possible. But most people don't see spending $120,000 to go to a university for 4 years to learn, you know, to get an MBA, and that's a cheap MBA. They don't see that as, you know, a fucking trap. And I think that both of those examples kind of highlights that the average person deeply mistrusts the stranger. And I think that that is like how one of the tendrils of Watiko are like playing through us and, you know, controlling us.
Yeah, a lot there. So to bring it, I think the big connecting notion is that when we look at a lot of these myths that propagate the idea that we are in some kind of dark, broken creation, so the version of the Gnostic myth that Erick is talking about, there are some versions of the Gnostic myth which are basically like the Matrix, where you have this malevolent demiurge, which demiurge, for this idea of a malevolent demiurge has become so prevalent that most people don't know there's nothing evil about the demiurge. Like if you read Plato, if you read a lot of ancient Greek literature.
It means craftsman, right?
Yeah, it just means craftsman. It just means craftsman. And the old ontology was just that you had this divine, transcendent truth, beauty, unity, and then that eventually flows into a divine mind, nous, and then nous wants to create, so it creates a vessel for itself to create through, and that's the demiurge. And the craftsman consciousness is what forges the cosmos, basically. However, somewhere along the line, this idea of a malevolent demiurge comes about. And Erick briefly mentioned this goddess, Sophia. That antidote to having your soul stuck in this sort of false illusion is this freeing feminine goddess energy, basically, that they called Sophia. And it was by the grace of this goddess that your soul could basically escape this false reality, and you could merge with the true God, the true oneness, the true divine mind. And I totally agree that I think the result of that way of looking at the world creates this inherent fear, and then that fear feeds back into this dark psychic cloud that's hanging over humanity that you're talking about, this Zod or this Wetiko or this this mindset that wants to gain maximum material and protect itself and isolate itself and other who we perceive to be different. And I do agree, man. I think that's the central venom circulating through the zeitgeist right now. And so I think what you're saying is that you think that developing a personal creative form of self-expression is one of the most potent ways to break yourself out of that way of thinking. And I agree, man, because to bring this back to that crazy quote about Hermes, Mercury, that Jung talks about, man, I just had one of those moments like in the middle of what I'm talking about. I'm like, does anyone know what the fuck we're talking about right now? I hope I'm connecting the dots. But again, what is he saying? He's saying this liminal being, this liminal energy is something that you have to be able to communicate with, to transform yourself, to individuate personally, to go through discovering who you really are. And the only way to tap into that is to do something unique. You have to do something unique. What is the word individuate? It's become unique. Learn, find yourself, know yourself. Don't leave any nook and cranny uncovered, even like the scariest, nastiest parts of your shadow, especially. And the only way you do that is through doing something unique. And doing something unique is always going to be creative. Doesn't matter what it is. But whatever your soul is crawling out to do, it is just calling out to do, man. Like that is a deep, important piece of evidence that you should not diminish. And especially if when you do it, synchronicities seem to pop up around it. That's like the universe laying out a path, I think, for you.
Yeah. So the story that comes to mind that I think will anchor this into like a frame that people can understand, that will also make them uncomfortable, because if this man was able to do it this way, none of us have a fucking excuse. So, Viktor Frankl, in 1945, had the opportunity to leave Austria because he was a psychiatrist. He was going to be able to get a visa, and he could have gotten away from the tide of Hitler's hatred for Jews. But his parents were both Jewish, and they wouldn't be able to leave. And so he was torn about whether or not to go. He went to visit his parents. And when he went to his parents' house, he saw that on the kitchen counter, there was a slab of marble that looked like it was debris from some type of structure. He asked his dad what it was, and his dad told him, this is a part of a temple that the Nazis destroyed, and I went and I grabbed a piece. And it was a piece of the wall that had the 10 Commandments on it. And Victor asked his dad, what part of the 10 Commandments is this slab? And his dad said, and I forget the exact quote, but it's basically, honor thy mother and thy father so they can have prosperity on this land, or something like that. He saw that as a synchronicity to stay. Within a couple of months, he was taken to Auschwitz. His wife was murdered, his brother was murdered, and both of his parents were murdered. His manuscript that he was working on for what would eventually become logotherapy got destroyed. And he had to live in the concentration camps for months. His urge and his inner vision of imagining himself teaching in lecture halls around the world the psychology of what happens in these concentration camps is what he credits as keeping him alive. And that the birth of his traumatic experience in those camps was man's search for meaning, which is arguably one of the greatest pieces of art that Western culture has ever created. It was the alchemy of him being in the Holocaust. And the most famous part of that book is the essence of what we're talking about here, is that he said that there were certain men in that camp that were a different class of man than all the other men there. And they were the type of men that when they saw someone who had given up, which is if they didn't get up to go work that day, that was basically them saying, like, I'm going to die today. These different type of men would go up to them and give them their last piece of bread. And that Victor said that witnessing that gave all the other men strength, because in that moment of hell, they saw something that was transcendent. And then that birthed the quote that the last of the human freedoms is man's ability to choose his attitude in any given situation. And the thing there is that if those men did not act that way, the ripple effect of the men giving up would have infected other men.
Yeah.
Victor may not have made it through that experience, and we would not have his individuated alchemical gift, which was man's search for meaning.
Yeah.
The essence of that story for me, whenever I connect to it, I cry, because it's like, if that man can say those words in that situation, we all have the opportunity to, whatever hell we think we're in, our art can be the little piece of bread that we give. And a part of art is you share it. And this is the thing that most artists in our time struggle with and get their ass kicked by resistance, is they don't share. You don't know who needs that piece of bread.
Yeah.
In the age of social media, you don't know who will see. And that the thing that's coming through me to like create and to help people create too is, it's like, we all have bread in us.
Yes.
And we don't know who needs it. And we live in a time where something like 50 to 80 people are killing themselves a day just in the United States. Over 300 million people in the world are disabled from depression, not just depressed. They're so depressed that they can't work. There's hundreds of millions of people who are diagnosed with anxiety disorders and other disorders like that. We live in a time where we need bread. And anyone who is able to even listen to this podcast, you are in the top 5% of people on this planet who have the opportunity to share their bread. And everyone's an artist. And I see almost no one out here being artists. Either they don't share at all, or the only art that they make is complaining or woe is me, or saying trite, vindictive things in people's comments. And it's like, all of you are artists. You're feeding something every time you make art, which is every time you speak. And we need more artists who make bread and not poison.
Yeah, really well put, man. Really well put. And this is kind of meandering into this soul sickness idea too, in that one of the ways that I really like to think about it is through the Terence McKenna riff, the whole famous culture is not your friend riff.
Right.
And what he really means by that is, look at the established way of doing things. Look at the channels available, most readily available for you to make a living, for you to go through the motions, for you to serve some master that you don't even personally know. Like, if you work for most businesses in this country, you probably don't even know who the fuck is running your business.
And it's not a person, it's probably an egregore.
Right, exactly, right? It's like, it's not even, like, even the CEO, he's beholden to the shareholders, and he's, whatever. So we're all serving this status quo that is commodifying the human soul, insulting the human soul, essentially placing us in a slightly longer leased matrix pod, right? Where we have just enough of an illusion of free will to feel like we're not completely squandering our lives, because we can go eat at a restaurant and put tasty calories in our mouths, and we can jerk off to porn, and we can listen to music we like or whatever. But the equation is the same thing. Like, you're just essentially burning out the candle of your life as a battery for some mechanized agent of this Zod being, right? Like, it's just a being that's made to just like queef darkness into the world and, make the shadow denser and blacker so that people consume more and just keep the system going and keep the system going. Why? To keep the system going, and you can only change that if you rebel. You can only change that if you're like, I'm not doing this. I don't care if it's easy. I don't care if it makes me more money. Like, you might have to play the game part-time. You might have to play the game for a few years, but eventually, like, unless you shift your mind into exactly what you're talking about to become an agent of both your own personal transformation and the betterment of humanity in the process of that, like, I don't think you find yourself on your deathbed stoked. I don't think you find yourself, I don't think you find yourself satisfied. I don't think you find yourself thinking life has a purpose. And you're probably a lot more tuned into that, thinking that you're living in a malevolent demiurge invention. Yeah.
And the thing to connect to is that we now live in a time where if people could alchemize their resistance to what social media is actually, like Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook and TikTok are not social media. They are specific aspects of that type of media. But that email, the internet, all of that shit is social media. And that the thing to connect to is that we live in a time now where if you just start to express yourself through the medium that is specifically calling to you, because whatever that specific medium is, that is where your greatness lies. That's where if you were to pursue that type of expression, you would be an N of one in the world. That if you start to do that consistently and you can be courageous and you share your work in a way where people who use the internet can find you, you only need what Kevin Kelly calls 1,000 true fans.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
If anyone listening, if you haven't heard about this idea, Google Kevin Kelly 1,000 true fans, because this is a revolutionary, game-changing time that if you could get over your own stuckness about what social media represents, you can literally, within a few years of hard work, live a life where you do not have to worry about money because you will make enough money, where you have people who want to hear from you, not because you know something that they couldn't find somewhere else or they couldn't ask ChatGPT, but because they specifically resonate with your specific view of whatever it is that you're the most interested in. And that if you actually got over your own preconceived kinks around money and around persuasion and around how to make a fucking landing page, whatever it is that you are intrinsically interested in, that no one has to pay you to go learn about, that you want to just make shit for, if you can start to frame it as, I'm going to share this, you can have a life in this age where you don't have to constantly worry about money. You're not going to have to work for any corporation if you don't want to. And you can do the thing that you love. And that this is because of social media. Like one of the things I recently did a Fit for Service event where I gave a talk to about 220 people. And it was over this idea of like Zod, and the thing that will heal it is art. And I had everybody close their eyes and I asked them to raise their hand if they have a specific artistic expression that they can feel that they are stuck in expressing. 99% of the people rose their hand. And then I asked them, how many people here have a block around using social media as a place to share your art? Everyone raised their hand. And then I asked them, how many of you are here because you heard about this on social media? Almost everyone rose their hand. And the people who are there, their report of that experience is that it's one of the most transformative things they've ever done. They meet new lifelong friends, blah, blah, blah. The beauty of everything that happens at our events was birthed through the fact that we have social media. Everyone who has ever found you on any podcast episode ever, it's because podcasts exist. Like our parents, if they didn't have access to a good library, they would never know who Alan Watts is. They would never have heard of Terrence McKenna. They wouldn't know who Joe Rogan or Tim Ferriss or anyone who has ever changed your life that you didn't meet at a fucking coffee shop is because of social media. And it's because all of them got over their own blocks around sharing their art. And that we live in a time where there is enough space for each person to be their individuated self and to actually make money. Like there's this big thing around modern artists and money where it's almost like a spiritual one-upmanship about how much I can talk about how bad money is. And it's like the people that I know personally who have some of the biggest like artistic expressions that want to come through them, they're one of the first people where if you get them one drink in, they start to talk about how fucked up capitalism is or how fucked up X, Y, and Z is, like things that are so much larger than them, that through them talking about how fucked up those things are, it justifies them not trying. It justifies them not making their art. And if you read The War of Art by Stephen Pressfield, he, better than anything I've ever read, will punch you in the fucking face about what resistance is.
Yeah.
That resistance is this archetypical force that will fucking kill you if you don't confront it. But it's not mad at you. It's just it's a function of the universe. And wherever your artistic calling is most concentrated is where resistance will come back at you in the hardest possible way. And just real quick, you could speak to this. You have known that your calling has been to go all in on this podcast and to start making videos and doing this type of shit for years.
Yeah.
And we would talk about it for years. And you didn't do it for years. And now you're doing it and you're fucking great at it and it's starting to blow up. So this might be a cool opportunity for you to talk about like resistance and all that shit.
Yeah. Well, when you were talking before and you first brought up Stephen Pressfield, the very first thing I thought of, particularly from the standpoint of people who are just in the Genesis part where they're like scared and they are hearing the voice of resistance, this core tenet of this book, I'm sure that this fits back in with your archetype of this malevolent modern God too, is that I'm scared, so I don't want to try. I'm afraid I don't have this, so I don't want to try. But there's this amazing quote coming from Stephen Pressfield in this book that's, if you find yourself asking your friends and your family member, am I really a creative? If you find yourself being afraid, if you find yourself being nervous, the answer is yes, because the real creatives always feel this way and they move through it. And it's the ones who have like boundless, idiotic self-confidence that don't make it because they're, and he doesn't elaborate to this point, but I think that makes a lot of sense because if you're so sure of yourself and it's going to be so easy and you're going to make it, what's going to happen when you do meet that resistance? It's going to like shatter your ego. And either you're going to need to like get over that or you're going to give up. And I think a lot of those people end up giving up or they justify using some story why, oh, it didn't work because of some bullshit out of their own control. But yeah, from my perspective, dude, the small modicum of success I'm starting to have, it's literally, I'm not doing anything different other than putting in the reps. That's it. There's nothing I'm doing different. Yes, I have more time. Yes, you slowly accumulate experience. But the difference between a video I put out that got 900 views and a video that has like, I don't know, 170,000 or whatever it is now is this. It's this different.
May I offer though, in the last Batman movie, when he was trying to get out of the hole, the teaching of that moment is that he had to take off the harness. That it was if I fail here, I die, that got him the extra 2 inches. And you literally just did the thing with your finger that like the difference between the two videos is just a couple of inches. What I would offer is that, yeah, space-time realm, not much has changed. In the realm of the psyche, you fucking told the universe, I'm all in. You fucking left your job.
Yeah. Yeah, it's true. But it didn't happen. It wasn't like I left my job and then everything blasted off. It took months and months and I'm still ramping up, you know?
Right.
But yeah, I mean, I think it it's the same with all of this stuff. Like if you're turned on by the more mythopoetic language and spiritual ontologies that Eric and I like to play with, or you just want pure circumstance and what works, you just can't put forth the same amount of effort if you're not all in. You just can't do it. And there's a switch that flips in your mind, and sometimes it doesn't flip quickly. It's not like going up to a light switch. It's like a switch that you get little by little by little, and then eventually you're like, things are different now. Things are different now. At a certain point, I got past the point where I was this, and now I'm this. And we can put all kinds of different mouth noises and legends around it, but it's just like, it's a slow transformation process where suddenly small degrees of behavioral change completely end up altering your trajectory in a way where now you're on a completely different continent. And that's what it feels like. And it's long, it's hard. It's not, it's, except for the people, I don't know how they do it, that get success really quickly. But man, it does, in my experience, now happen. It's really all I can say.
And the other aspect that I want to bring in here is that taking away whether or not you quote unquote get success from making your art, the process of making art starts to cultivate what will be the most intimate relationship that any human is capable of having. And it's the relationship that the truth of who you are, which is just fundamental storyless awareness, that thing relating to the myth maker in you. Your entire life is the result of your myth making. And whatever your artistic act is that calls to you, it's almost like you're showing up to the relationship with your myth maker every day. And the thing is that when you start dying in your moment of death, no one is going to be there with you. And again, the truth of what you are is this contentless awareness. The only thing that will be with you is going to be your myth maker, the myth part of you. And that art is the lifelong process of having the most intimate type of love with the myth making part of you. Because what's the ultimate byproduct of the highest form of love? It's creation. And that art is the byproduct of the relationship between the truth of who you are, which is this contentless awareness, and the most intimate part of your psyche, which is the myth maker. And that, like, there are great poets and great artists who if we had the opportunity to podcast with them and they got over their anxiety, they would be almost mystics. But in their lifetime, no one even knew that they made art. Like, there's this documentary about this woman in New York who took pictures like every fucking day for 50 years, didn't show it to anyone. And there was just this, her apartment was a museum. That woman was alive. Now, the thing that I would offer is that if she had had someone around her to help her get over her fear and she actually shared her art in her life, it would have been an even grander life.
Yeah.
Someone like Emily Dickinson couldn't get over getting out, but she still had that intimate relationship with her myth maker, and she produced some of the best poetry that's ever been produced in Western culture.
Yeah.
And the truth of it is that no mystical shit here, just biological truth. No assemblage of DNA has ever existed before you that was like you, and no assemblage of DNA will ever exist after you. The asterisk there is unless we get really weird with cloning and shit. But
Right.
So each of us are a constellation of light and vibration that is completely unique in the entire expanse of eternity. And God wants to, this is where it starts to get mystical, but God wants to know what you see. And whatever it is that you express, like, you're telling God, this is how I see it. And I think that there's something intrinsically healing once you start that process. And it's a much longer tangent that we don't need to go down. But I think a fun way to look at the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual is these are all of the types of patterns that a denied artistic function can manifest in a modern human. And one of the things that Jung talked about is that if he could get the neurotic to make art, he knew that they would eventually heal themselves.
Like, this is a way better way, I think, to think about faith. Like, rather than, I don't know there's a God, but I'm just going to pray to a God and believe there's a God. How about instead, you conceive of faith as, I don't know if I'm capable of doing it. I don't know. But what if I just put one foot in front of the other in the way that feels like the most authentic, unique expression that I'm capable of? And I do think about that as a sacred act. Like, even if in the mundane I'm doing something as innocuous as like sitting in front of Final Cut Pro, like lining shit up and going and getting like, you know, like stock images or something. Like, if you really are holding a higher ideal, like, I'm going to do my best with what I have, and I'm going to try to secrete a little medicinal drip drop into the world, and that's your overarching ethos, just try it. Try it for a while. See how it makes you feel. See how it changes your life. See what people it brings into your life. See how it changes your relationship with what you conceive of creativity to be. See how it eventually changes the way that you think of God. And this might sound ridiculous, but we were just talking about before that if you read The War of Art by Stephen Pressfield, which is this amazing quick read about creative expression, he very quickly gets into the mystical. He talks about the muse, and he's not talking about the muse metaphorically. Like, he's talking about actual, extra, intelligent, transcendent beings that will come to you and give you information and give you inspiration. And are you going to be able to perfectly, faithfully, with 100% resolution, bring their visions into the world? No, you're not. But if you try and you show up like a blue collar worker in the way that he puts it, then they'll come. Then they'll show up and they'll give you something. They'll give you inspiration. And that's what it takes. So I think thinking of faith in that way, that's exciting to me.
Like, the thing that comes to mind is to bring Hermes back into this. There is no way to dedicate yourself to trying to make the type of art that calls to you and not experience the quality of synchronicity that demands almost like a testimony to the fact that there's something intelligent and benevolent larger than you. And what I mean by that is that if you learn how to listen to the whisper inside of you, it will call you to try things that scare you. So there are things that are slightly beyond what you're currently capable of doing. If you have the faith to try to make that thing and you show up every day, like, you're not an amateur, you're a pro. You show up every day and you try every day. There are days where I show up to write and I'm convinced this is going to fucking suck. I don't know what I'm doing. And then there's a moment almost every time where there's this like insight that I don't know where it came from that calls me back to a book that's on my shelf that I haven't reread in 7 years. And I open it up and I see that I made a mark that points to a quote that perfectly fits into what I've been trying to articulate. And that happens over and over and over again. I think there's something inherent in the act of making art, specifically the type of art that your daemon calls you to make, not your ego, that has built into it a religious aspect that doesn't need any dogma, and that the byproduct of the faith action is not more dogma, it's art. It's bread. It's bread for other people. And so I just wanted to offer that thing up about faith. And the other aspect of it is there's something about dogmatic religion that, like, at best, it can create false humility, but it makes people the opposite of humble. That if there's a dogmatic religion and they fucking know what the rules are and they know who the people who aren't the chosen people, there's no humility.
Yeah.
And false humility is the coward's arrogance. But art will humble you constantly. Like, and to go back to your point about like the people who aren't self-conscious, they're not going to be good artists. There's a quote, I forget who it's by, but the essence of it is that the thing that crushes you when you first start to make art is the thing that will eventually make you a great artist, and it's your taste. Your taste is the thing that crushes you when you first start, because nothing that you make fits your taste. But it's because you have great taste. And the great taste is what sets the upper limits of how good your art can become. The person who is completely like, oh, I fucking crushed it in their first year as a writer, it's because their taste is so low that they're able to hit it now. And so this is used as like encouragement for the beginners who feel like they'll never be good enough. It's like you can only feel that if you have great taste. So trust your taste. And this gets into an interesting part of why I think art is like the foundations of like a clean religion, is that you don't get to choose your taste.
Yeah.
You don't get to
Or your
choose what
talent.
you're
Yeah.
interested in. You don't get to choose the people that you hate or the people that trigger you or the people that you envy. You don't get to choose who you fall in love with. You don't get to choose what characters from a movie you like or what movie you like. There is something deeper in you that is choosing for you. And I think that is like, those are the fingerprints of the daemon in you. There is this larger thing behind your ego that speaks through your ego as interest, as envy, as inspiration, and the artistic process is learning to trust that thing.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah. All this taste about all of this talk about bread and taste. It's making me want to go get a little. When's the last time you had a bread bowl? I feel like those were big when we were
High
like
school.
teenagers.
Yep.
Go get yourself a bread bowl of clam chowder. Let's talk about soup for the rest of this podcast.
Cool.
Really
Let's
bring it
go.
down to earth. I know you're a broth boy. I know you like you a good ramen broth.
I am a broth boy.
Dude, 100%. I want to start a side social media account called Broth Boys, and it's just like pictures of and videos of delicious soups and broths. But speaking of broth, I have no idea where this is going to go, but I just wanted to say that.
Perfect trickster Hermes energy right now.
The base of any creative soup is always going to be what you're talking about. It's always going to be whatever that unique thing is inside of you that goes by many names. And we haven't talked like specifically about getting in touch with whatever that is, or the discipline of recognizing what that thing is in this podcast, at least. And I think one of the main reasons that people just don't think this way is because they just don't, like, we've lost the language for it, for one, other than like weirdos like you and me who talk about the daimon or the genius all the time. But for two, because they just really don't believe that there's any kind of ontological reason, a priori thing that they're being progenerated into their life with. And of course, I don't know ontologically if we are. I don't know for sure that like the myth of is true and the Platonic, riffs that come out of the Republic that talk about this stuff are true. But I do know that they seem to fit an archetype. And this is where the archetypes get very practical, because it's like, whether or not they exist somewhere in some realm or not, they are endemic to the way that we think about the world. They just are. So whether or not it's one or the other, I think one of the core things is to find a way to recognize the arrangement of those archetypes in your own mind, the ones you feel the most kinship with, the ones you feel pulled toward, the ones that represent the way that you feel like help you express what feels right to you. It's a lot of evidence. Like, it's a lot of evidence for how you're probably, quote unquote, supposed to do this expression that you're talking about. And I know that you have a really multifaceted background in terms of how you explore this, like through visionary experiences, through creativity. But I wonder if anything has altered or clarified or gotten more blurry about all of this that we're talking about, getting in touch with this thing in the wake of everything you've been through recently. Because obviously you've been through such an intense period of visionary exploration recently.
So there's a few things that come up, and this might be a long tangent, but I think it's exactly what you're talking to. And there are a couple of ways to come at this. One, everything that we're talking about only makes sense, and this might sound triggering, but it only makes sense if you've been sleepwalking your entire life. And what I mean by that is, if you begin to meditate, you will very quickly understand you are not in control of what your mind is doing almost ever. If you begin to have a reflective life, you can start to see the mountain of evidence that you sleepwalk on top of, that there is something else going on behind your ego that is trying to call you towards something that feels like it's for you. And like one of the core questions that I ask on my podcast is, what is the first movie or story that you really fell in love with as a child? My sister, who is 10 years younger than me, because of stuff going on with our family, me and my sister that was 1 year younger than I, we had to raise her while my mom worked often. When she was 2 years old, she became obsessed with Finding Nemo. Fast forward 20 years, we were just talking about this the other day because she's currently visiting. She knows everything that I'm about and that I've been to. And she asked me, like, do you think that I loved Finding Nemo because my real dad actually left and that I was trying, like, I wanted to find him? Her biological father did not show up to her life. She was 2. The mythopoetic story of Finding Nemo is the main character is trying to find his dad. That was etched in her in a way that she didn't even have an ego yet. And she would want to watch it every day. I've interviewed over 100 people for my podcast. Every single person, they share whatever their core story is. And often without me having to call anything to it, at some point in the podcast, they have an aha moment. They're like, oh my God, that's my mythopoetic life. There is something in you yearning to be made expressed through you if you would slow down and start to listen to it. So that's one way. So that's kind of the Jungian mythopoetic, examine your early life for clues route. A hyper rational argument is that if you study enough philosophy and enough cognitive psychology, you will learn that humans can't know objective truth. The best we can do is we make up sense-making stories. And that ultimately, if you bring enough rational skepticism to anything other than mathematics, and now with what's happening in physics, maybe even that's not objectively true. Nothing is objectively true. So you could get lost in postmodernism and believe that everything is equally true. But regardless of whatever it is you believe, your actions confess that in this moment, I'm going to choose to believe this story. So like if you have to go to the bathroom, you're choosing to believe that it is a better outcome that you don't shit your pants than to go shit in the toilet. And so if you want to go that hyper rationalistic route, you can get to the point where it's like, okay, what set of stories do I want to pretend are true by acting them out in my life? And then you get to experiment. And the bottom line is that these set of stories that I've been talking about are the most fun, beautiful, useful, and inspiring stories that I have found. But I'm not beholden to the idea that they're objectively true, because the philosopher in me is like, none of it's objectively true. But postmodernism is a story that no one can actually act out.
Right.
And so even the postmodernists, if you hang out with them for a day, like You tell me you don't believe in anything. Let me see your Google Calendar for a week. I'll show you what you believe in. And you probably believe in Netflix and being on your phone for 9 hours a day, probably on some type of medication for your mental health because you've been told a story by our current institutions that make them a lot of money, but you don't feel better.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I had to laugh there because just the very like sober and insistent way that you said you believe it's a better story to not shit your pants was just a very well articulated and funny way to put it. But yeah, I agree. And though I am not a postmodernist, it's such an airtight philosophical argument. This idea that every like truth is relative and truth is just like this cultural object that's manifested based on your point of view and like what's going on around you at the time. It's such an airtight argument that it's almost like talking about natural selection or evolution, because it's just, you can't disprove it. Like it covers all the bases when it comes to things that are actually happening in the world and the way people behave. But I don't think it is true. I think that there are, I mean, I don't like to just start going off a rant where I say I think, because who gives a shit what I think. But
everyone listening to your podcast, how dare you?
To an extent, yes. But I think the reason they care what I think is because it's not just that I think it. Like it doesn't matter if I think this or I think that. It needs to stand on its legs logically. And I think that I don't even know why I'm going down this road, because I don't know if it really serves this conversation. So I'm going to sidestep where I was going.
Well, the thing I want to offer real quick to the postmodernism being airtight, a metaphor that I use to move through my frustration with Sam Harris whenever he talks with anyone on a podcast about free will is it's like when two humans are talking about ideas, you can think of it as like two people have walked into a arena to play a specific type of game that has rules. When Sam Harris starts to talk about you don't have free will when it's two humans talking, it's like he breaks the rackets and you can't play anymore. It's like, okay, well, what do you want to do now? The postmodernism, everything is relatively true and everything is actually not objectively true. That's the same type of thing. It's only airtight if you think the totality of existence is to play that game. But again, anyone who offers the postmodernism philosophy as a way to like end the game of using words to talk about anything, it's like, let's just hang out for a day. I promise you, if I hang out with you for a week, I'm going to see you get upset about something. And as soon as I see you get upset about something, I'm seeing the truth that everything you said about the postmodern shit was bullshit. It was a tactic that you learned to stop that type of game from being played, but no human lives that way. No, you could not live your day if you didn't have a hierarchy of value of story that made one story more important than the other. Otherwise, you would shit your pants.
Right. Yeah. And I think it's one of those things where it's like in one dimension of truth telling, it's airtight. Like it's intellectually true if you zoom in on some, sociological behavior or ritual or way people conduct themselves in a society. But is it ontologically true? No. Is it emotionally true? No. It's not true in the way that human beings actually express themselves. So I don't know if you got to the point, or if we just like riffed around it. But the question before about has anything changed in the wake of the recent exploration with how you think about this idea of identity, self-expression, sense-making, connecting to your purpose? Because I know you did have this insight about the importance of like turning people on to a more artistic way of being, but what was it that precipitated that?
A thing that I've been grappling with for a couple of years now is what is my life's task that is able to incorporate what I've learned about existential risk. So this is actually like a multi-year integration thing. Like when I discovered what existential risk was, it fucked me up. I have a mind map program on my computer that I worked on for like probably 50 days in a row that has like 120, like I made a whole map of trying to make sense of existential risk theory because it kind of fucked up my life. Like I didn't have a life task that really felt like it made sense because before existential risk theory, my life's vision was really about me and my family. And I wanted to like have my home out in the woods. I did philosophy. I made a podcast. I wrote books, but I just wanted mine.
Mhm.
And it wasn't until I really started to appreciate that, like, the momentum of our culture, there is no way that I can look at it and from my gut not feel if I don't contribute the best I possibly can to inspire as many other people who resonate with me to also give their best, I don't think we make it. And it's not that I'm important, it's that I am inspired to help. I believe that every little iota of particles that contribute to the alchemy of Zod, if you will, is worth the effort. And that over the last 2 years, kind of the like where the rubber meets the road of like what is my daily life task that feels like it meets all of these needs in my life is to do everything I can to inspire the sleeping artist in people. Because there's a couple of things here. One, and I hope to flesh this out more in like a book one day, but to your point about the diagnostic and statistic manual, I think the most elegant solution to our mental health problems is to tell a new story about what it means to be an artist. And that if I can, like, if you could merge the worlds of like Andrew Huberman optimization with the body and what Terence McKenna was trying to do, like if you could make some type of archetypical avatar that merges all of that as like an inspiration to young people about how to be, I think that will take care of a lot of the mental health stuff. But also, like, we need a new renaissance, like an actual renaissance where the artists are actually making things that actually fucking work. Like it's not just here's my trip report about the shit I did in the astral. Like that's cool to a point. Really, I think all that is symbolic alchemy for wounds. Like, I don't think we're going to change the world by you doing more ayahuasca, you know? But to the degree that you have things that inhibit you from contributing to the world, do the ayahuasca that you need to do.
Yeah.
But the thing about the Renaissance is that these people were massively changing the character of the zeitgeist through the type of art that they were making.
Yeah.
And that sometimes it was just fucking aqueducts or like a new type of machine. So it's not just this like ephemeral esoteric shit. And so it feels like the most useful story that I can advocate for is kind of giving a new perspective on what it means to be an artist in the 21st century. I really want to alchemize and completely eat the old story of an artist of like tortured, unhealthy, and kind of like not practical. Like I want to tell a story of the artist as like a fucking robust, healthy human who has their esoteric element of their art, but that they're ultimately trying to bend the mastery of their art towards actually doing things for the culture. And that I think you can do all of that and fucking be healthy and not have to worry about money. Like that feels like that's a core thing that needs to be alchemized. I know too many great artistic people who aren't doing anything because they have this story that if they're going to be an artist, it means that they can't have money. And if they make money, then they can't be an artist. And I think that's a fucking tragedy.
Yeah. One of the things you said in that really kind of connected a lot of dots for me as to what you're talking about
in both the macro and the micro aspect, is you use the phrase like the alchemy of Zod. And I didn't think of it that way, that this force that is malevolent, or at least is having a negative overall effect on humanity, this dark, shadowy, Wetiko, whatever you want to call it, that too is going through a collective transmutation process and a collective individuation. And that if something can transform in quality on a collective level, the only way that that happens is through a bunch of individuals changing their own minds. And I guess it doesn't necessarily change what's going on in this like collective unconscious technically, but it makes it so the way the contents of the collective unconscious actually appear in the world have now fundamentally changed, because people are playing an active role rather than a passive role where they're
Right.
serving their more instinctual animal part of themselves first and foremost, and then isolating themselves, et cetera, et cetera. Now they're playing this bigger macro game with a vision on something transcendent, with a vision on a better world, with a vision on a better personal life, all of these different things. They feel more connected, they feel more purposeful. And yeah, that is really, that connects those dots for me, for sure.
And the thing that just came to mind is it's like, there's a couple of things here. One of the things I want to make clear is like Zod is not inherently malevolent. It is the actual prima materia that the alchemy can be made from. It is the unprocessed grief that the art could be made from. But you can think of Wetiko or Zod as the atmosphere that Auschwitz was trying to put into the prisoners, and that many of the prisoners succumbed to its story. But the prisoners that brought their bread were the revolutionaries. They were attempting to seed a renaissance that was changing the atmosphere of that place. And the thing that I'm trying to advocate for is it's that there is no one listening who does not feel in their gut that there's something profoundly wrong with our world. The response not to have is to be the prisoners that give up. And I think if people are being honest with themselves, most of the people who are not actively creating some part of a more beautiful world, and that could just be their art, if you're not actively creating from your core, you are a version of the prisoners that have given up.
Yeah.
And that anything that is coming from the place of like, to create is to actually believe in hope. Like, to create anything, embedded in the action is the belief that it could be better. And that we need, I want to see as many artists give their bread as is fucking possible. And that I see too many great sleeping artists who don't believe that their bread is worth it or that it'll do anything. And I think that's bullshit.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, let's be honest, it's like there is a certain amount of marination, of preparation, of education, of all of these things required so that you can serve a tasty bread in a nice bread bowl with a rich broth. It's like, it's not just as simple as dumping Campbell's soup in the microwave and we're going to change the world, right? Like there is grinding involved. There is treacherous waters that you need to move through psychically, physically, vocationally in this process. Like you might get more lucky than some, you might get less lucky than some, whatever. Your pathway is going to be unique, but you got to believe it. I mean, it gets back to that faith idea that I was talking about before. Like if we can popularize that notion of faith, I think that's like a core mythological piece of the puzzle for me. Like there's something really moving about that for me, that, if there's this mythological never-ending mountain that we're going up, I guess the question is this: you don't know if there's a top of the mountain. So does that make you want to never set foot on the mountain, or does it make you want to climb the mountain anyway? Right? It's like, that's sort of like the core proposition that we're talking about. It's like, there's an available journey. There's an available path. And you can either take it or just be like, nah, that sounds hard. And if you go down the latter path, you are, as you said, one of those prisoners that's given up, I think. And
the thing that I want to offer there is that one of the frames or stories that I'm trying to invite people into is it is a lie to believe that the context of the story is you alone going up a mountain. There is a whole species that all the other species depend on to get their shit together, that are all going up an infinite spiral together. And you are alive in this time. You can either contribute to the rising up through the spiral, or you can be something that other people have to drag. There is no, the lie of Sisyphus is that he is alone.
right.
That's the big lie, is that we are baton carriers between generations. And a part of the mythopoetic death of meaning of our time is that we think that we're alone on the track, and we're just trying to find out whether or not it's worthwhile to run at all. And the other part is one of the oldest mythological motifs in Western culture comes from Homer, and it's the Trojan horse. The thing that I'm trying to Trojan horse is that the process of making art creates a vehicle around you that will help you endure the tragedy, the absurdity, and the pain of life more robustly than any ideology and all the religions that are lies. Because, like, I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole, but yeah, that's the thing I'm trying to Trojan horse, is that the lifelong commitment to the artistic process is the most enduring vehicle to endure life.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it is. And I don't see any way out. I mean, there's that other really famous Terence McKenna riff about how if the creatives and the artists can't save the world, then no one can. And I don't remember exactly what that riff is, but it's a great one, and everybody should look it up, because he really connects the dots in a succinct, very mythopoetic way that it's so undeniable when he puts it the way that he puts it. And especially moving forward, dude, in a world where we have AI, and it's going to be easier and easier to get things just done. Things that need to get done. The only thing, and I think I've made a meme about this, is that AI is eventually, and technology is eventually going to back us into a corner where there's nothing left to do except individuate. Like, it's like all your needs are met. Like, are you just going to continuously soak in enjoying scratching all of your itches and all of the id pleasures of life? Or are you going to finally be like, what's the soul thing? What's the soul thing that everybody talks about? And the only way that there's some fundamental absurd action that comes, and the absurdity lies in, like, what I was alluding to before, where it's like, I'm sitting down in front of a computer and I'm moving a bunch of blocks around, making a fucking video I'm going to post on YouTube, for instance, or we're just making these mouth noises, and somehow it's cathartic. Somehow it makes both of us feel alive and animated and whatever. There's no inherent reason why that should be the case. It's just all a bunch of, like, noise and vibrations in infinity. But at least on an individual level, it changes the quality of life dramatically. And at a certain point, you got to get over this hump where you think like, oh, that like this doesn't matter. My shitty drawing doesn't matter. My idea doesn't matter. Like whatever it is, there is that weird hump that you just have to be like, I'm going to go over it and I'm going to go through that barrier. And when you go through the barrier, that's the first initiation. When do you think that was for you, Eric? When do you think that was for you, that you were like, you believed enough to take a step
Yeah. So
for the first time?
I've actually written about this because it's one of the most important moments of my life, but we've talked about it. But when I was a kid, I had this traumatic experience of trying to comprehend what forever meant. And it like deeply wounded my soul about my relationship to the divine. I became a hardcore atheist to the point where whenever anyone would talk about their belief in God, I would debate with them, often to the point of making them cry, like in class. And I thought that I was like the arbiter of truth. And then when I got to college, I obsessively studied analytical philosophy and all the parts of cognitive psychology that emphasize how all of our intuitions are bullshit and how they're all the byproducts of our evolutionary programming, and that we're basically the endpoint I got to by the time that I graduated was there was a part of me that believed humans have to create stories in order to deal with the inherent absurdity of life, and that if we didn't have stories, we would kill ourselves right now, and that we're all delusional and it's all pointless. And I did a mushroom trip where I was hiking and I got to this top of a hill, and that part of me really started to like make a strong case as to like, give up, don't try. Like you've like, it wasn't kill yourself, but it was like, don't try, don't do it, because it's all bullshit. And this other part of me came forward that felt like a kid, and it was just laughing and crying, but crying from a place of joy. And it was like, this was all felt. It wasn't articulated until I wrote about it afterwards, but it felt like the child part of me came so the nihilistic part, in hindsight, it felt like Anubis. It felt like, the god of judgment and death. And it was like, this is all fucked. And then it felt like my child part came forth, and it was like, maybe you're right, but I'm going to choose to make art. Like it was this idea of like, if this is true and I'm in hell, there's 8 billion other people who are trapped in hell with me. Art can make it better.
Yeah.
And so like, I got to the point where it was like, maybe I'm in hell. And if I was in hell, I would make art.
Yeah. What's interesting is I think you articulated my exact curvature with psychedelic experiences in general as well. Like I always experience that feeling of hopelessness, and then I usually have some kind of transcendent experience as well at some point. And then you come back to this realization, and the core realization for me is always the brevity and the like, I'm really going to die. I'm really going to die someday. Everybody I care about is really going to die. And you can get lost in the dread of that and the pointlessness and the sort of existential emo element of that. Or you can be like, again, the act of faith to do something with the time you have in a way that only you can do it. And that's usually where I end up, is like contributing to that larger process in whatever like potentially infinitesimal or pointless way that I'm able to. It's like the only option available. And I think, again, because I'm a mythopoetic weirdo, that this circles back to this Hermes archetype, because it works with all possible binaries, where it's especially in these liminal states where your mind is expanded. It like does the equivalent of holding your head underwater in the dread and in the hell and in the like, this is the transcendent. this is the, and sometimes you go back and forth several times. And then you get done with this like liminal journey, and your mind and your ego reassembles itself. And it's like, now what? You know, it's like, and you're forced to figure out what the now what is for yourself every time. And for whatever reason, as all of the data is indicating in all of these studies, it actually helps most people. It actually inspires most people.
Yep.
It actually makes people think there is a point to life, despite being more aware of the fact that they really are going to die. And that's a really interesting trickstery piece of wisdom right there, isn't it? That like this thing that we hide away from all the time, our mortality, because we don't want to think about ceasing to exist and the fact that this might all be pointless. It's actually by really getting psychically drowned in that a lot of times that you're like, oh, okay, I'm definitely going to die, but also there is some higher meaning. It's weird how that shakes out.
You're actually reminding me of like kind of the interesting thing about this recent bout with ayahuasca is if like I didn't have any chill nights, I didn't have any easy nights, and it was most intense on the third night, but every night, like anyone who has done ayahuasca will be able to empathize, and anyone who hasn't, it's not going to make sense, but there's a degree of intensity of that thing where there's no lesson, there's no insight, there's no teaching. It is simply so overwhelmingly destructively painful that the only thing that it forces you to do is to endure. And I got to the point on one night where I watched myself in my mind's eye attempt to kill myself. Like I watched myself stand up, run out of the maloca, find the ledge and jump off of the ledge and break my neck. And as soon as that relaxed, the absolute bliss of simply being in a state of non-abject terror and pain was transcendent. And that there's something about the human psyche where it's like you can only deal, you can only comprehend and contemplate meaninglessness when you're comfortable.
Yeah.
Because there's something inherent about being under threat. Like put a postmodernist in front of a wild animal that wants to eat them, they have me. Period. Right. And the really interesting thing that I don't know if it will make sense, but I hope it will, is that every indigenous wisdom tradition that I have met an elder of, their highest technology is not language, it's song and music. Whenever someone is having a psychotic break in those environments, it's not words, it's song and music that brings them back. Whenever anyone is in pain, it's not words, it's song and music that helps them move whatever is happening. And that there's something inherent about the structure and the experience of being in music and being in song that I think is the answer to the malaise of like what to do. And what I mean by that is, as long as your heart is beating, there is a song that's trying to come through you. Whenever you are in tune with that song and you let it dance you, you're not talking philosophy. Now, for some of us, our dancing is when we do talk philosophy and we feel radically alive. But if you're the average person contemplating whether or not life is meaningful, you're not dancing.
Yeah.
And when you're dancing, you're not talking about whether or not life is meaningful. When you're in the rapture of a sunset, or you're right before an orgasm during sex, no one is talking about whether or not life is meaningful or what to do. you know exactly what to do. Right before you come, you know what you're doing. When you're watching a sunset, you know that nothing matters but you simply being quiet and looking at this thing. And like, to be the artistic process is the process of learning how to dance to your song. And then when you're dancing to your song, you produce bread.
Yeah.
You're not thinking about whether or not it's meaningful or useful.
That's right, man. Yeah. And you sense eventually when that spirit is moving through people, regardless of what their discipline is. It's like when you see like a Japanese chef who's just like single-mindedly creating something as mundane as a noodle, and they've been doing that every single day with just single-minded, precise focus. What is it that makes that more beautiful than a package of Maruchan? It's like like from a literal perspective, you'd have to go down the nutrition label, right? You have to be like, oh, well, it says this many calories, says much sodium. But we know on a deeper level that one has magic and one doesn't. And you can sense the magic in any medium when someone's really playing with that transcendent fire. Like you sense it in mystical poets like Rilke or Hafez or Rumi. You sense it when you're going on an impassioned rant from somewhere that feels higher than your own ego. You sense it in amazing art. And that shit, to me, is what life is about. It is the very thing that you can't prove. Like, it is the very thing that moves the heart and like swells up the vagus nerve. And if you were to tell me right now that that doesn't matter and that's not, you could somehow convince me that that's not real, that would crush my soul. But I would have a hard time believing you. I'd have a hard time believing you. You'd have to have a very compelling argument.
So
Because
two things there.
I sense deeply with something that is not the intellect.
So
That's the truth.
we're going to have to do a whole podcast on this. We're not going to be able to do it in this podcast, but a thing that I've been writing an essay on that I've put on hold and I'm going to come back to it is what I'm calling the modern mythic confusion. And what you're articulating there is, I'm going to try to give a overview, but the essence of it is that we've been playing with worldviews since we've had culture. And each worldview has been trying to acquire more power because the worldview that has more power has more warriors, has more food, has more money. And that religion got to the point, like the three monotheistic religions got to a point where they like controlled the whole league of worldviews. And they did such a bad job with that power that once the scientific revolution started, a lot of people wanted to kill those gods. And so with the rise of the scientific worldview, we killed the monotheistic gods. And, there's that quote by Nietzsche, blah, blah, blah. What has happened since then is the scientific worldview has gotten so powerful that all the other worldviews, whether or not they realize it, they try to use the criteria of the scientific worldview to prove their points. And they don't realize it, but they've already lost.
Right.
There are two realms that we live in. And one is the space-time realm, and that's where the scientific worldview dominates. But there's the realm of psyche that is not space-time. And like if you go down the, is it Hoffman? What's his first name?
Don Hoffman.
Yeah. His shit is one of the entry points into this, but like your dreams, what you're thinking right now, your imagination, that is not of space-time. And if you don't know how to be in the psyche without being contaminated by space-time, you've lost the ability to generate authentic meaning. They're not the same places. Where they overlap is your individual human body and you get to play around with that. And that's where the placebo effect can make cancer grow and make it go away, blah, blah, blah. But that the scientific worldview, if you can't put it in its place, that's what starts to kill the soul. And Carl Jung's whole thing about like man's search for meaning is his attempt to try to begin to talk about this contamination of the scientific worldview to go into a realm that if you're just an honest philosopher, it has no place. And that there's a whole realm of existence that the scientific worldview cannot touch. And that the 300 million people who are disabled by their depression, plus everybody else, is lost in this confusion right now.
Yeah, 100%, man. And I went pretty deep through Man's Search for Meaning in my most recent exploration. And there's a great quote where he talks about depression being a spiritual dryness. Like depression is like, it's not, I mean, obviously, I think one of the hilarious parts about depression is that the prevailing myth is that it is caused by an event in space-time, right? It is caused by like a chemical imbalance in your brain.
For everyone listening, it's not. For everyone listening, it is not. There's not a single piece of scientific evidence that has ever proven that. It's not.
And you don't have to listen to Eric and I had Chris Palmer from Harvard on. He said the same thing. Lisa Miller from Columbia, she said the same thing. And these are people who have looked at brains in MRI. And yes, there can be things wrong with your brain, for sure, that will deeply impact the way that you perceive the world, can cause a bad time in the world. But this notion that there's a chemical imbalance and an SSRI is going to fix it, it's a manufactured idea. But speaking of other podcasts, that might be another podcast. But to just fully illustrate your point, man, like I'm going to read this one quote from Man's Search for Meaning.
I love it.
That speaks exactly to what we're talking about. And that Jung knew, I think he wrote this in like 1927 or something, if I'm not mistaken. And by the way, Jung was not a conventionally religious person. He was a spiritual person, but not a conventionally religious person. And he goes as far as you can go, basically, with communicating the point that you're making and I'm making. And I'm going to find this quote quick, because I know it's in my notes somewhere. I have treated many hundreds of patients among those in the second half of life, that is to say, over 35. There has not been one whose problem in the last resort was not that of finding a religious outlook in life. It's safe to say that every one of them fell ill because he had lost that which the living religions of every age have given their followers, and none of them has really been healed who did not regain his religious outlook.
Amen.
Yeah.
That is fucking beautiful. And what I'm like, part of the core of what I'm called to do is to offer a set of myths and stories for modern people that can provide the religious view without any dogma. And I think it's art.
I'm with you on that, brother. I'm with you on that. And I hope in this last 2 hours or so, Eric and I tickled your wonder pickle to an extent that you now are horny for creation in whatever way that you feel called to execute it and inseminate this world with more wonder. I know you always make me want to do it, Eric.
Likewise, truly.
Thanks for doing it, man.